give a warm welcome to Dianna.
So this is my book launch. You guys are making history with me tonight, so thank you for that. Notable Figures in Kalamazoo Area History was the title that I pitched to my editor. They didn't like it. They came out with Kalamazoo County Characters instead. They thought it was kitschier. I thought, well, some of these people are historic. I wouldn't call them all characters, but you don't argue with your publisher when they pick a title, so they're doing all the work. So a little bit about my background real quick. I actually took my very first breath in Kalamazoo. I was born here in May of 1969. I was born on my brother's 5th birthday, and he was the gift that he wanted to give back. He didn't want that gift on his 5th birthday. And we shared our birthday celebrations up until even just today. So I was born and raised in Plymouth. And I came to Western Michigan University and got my degree in print and broadcast journalism. So Kalamazoo is really where I spent most of my growing up. You know, Plymouth, if anybody's ever been up there, back in the 80s, you know, we didn't have any box stores then. So if you wanted to go school shopping, you came to Kalamazoo. You wanted to see Santa Claus, you came to Kalamazoo. Everything was involved in Kalamazoo. And so putting this book together was really just a focus in on stories that I've heard over the years that I felt other people might want to know about. And so I put together an initial list of 150 people, and then 50 made the cut, which is the handout that you have. Working with Ryan here at the library, his team, they provided some suggestions and a lot of help with research. My dad, who's actually on the back cover there, helped with a lot of the initial research. And I found as I was picking certain people that I wanted to put in the book, all along I had this one person in mind, and then I'd learn about someone else in their family, and so my interest diverted a little bit. So you'll hear a little bit about that tonight as well. One of the things, this is, like I said, the first time I've given this presentation, so one of the things that's been interesting for me on this also is there's a couple people in the program tonight that aren't in the book. They didn't make that 50 cut, but with the presentation I'm allowed to have a little bit more flexibility to tell a few more stories. So, but you know, the word Kalamazoo is out there a lot. We just heard it in a couple different songs. I think there's probably 10 songs in that playlist. But it shows up in a lot of children's literature. I mean, it's a pretty fun word to say, isn't it? And as I've been signing the books, I'm finding it's a really fun word to spell out too, especially with a shark. So in literature, L. Frank Baum, who wrote what? Wizard of Oz. He wrote several poems, and he wrote one here about a boy from Kalamazoo who ate too much celery stew. Well, it's interesting because you're going to learn tonight that celery was grown commercially for the very first time in Kalamazoo. So L. Frank Baum actually had a summer home over near Holland in Macatawa. So he probably was a little familiar with this area. They also grew celery in that area over in Holland and Zeeland area. But, you know, there was a boy from Holland who ate celery stew, just doesn't have the same ring. So we have that benefit. Kalamazoo shows up in several other children's books. It's in Horton Hatches the Egg. It's in The Train to Timbuktu, from Timbuktu to Kalamazoo. It's in this little 25-cent Tweety book, and I have actually the Timbuktu and the Tweety books up on the table if anybody wants to flip through. And of course, Jonathan Rand, who's a Michigan author, wrote Creepy Clowns of Kalamazoo. It was his very first book in that series. And I remember taking my son to meet him at a book event at the Willard Library over in Battle Creek. But we're also in some adult literature. We have Kalamazoo showing up in several poems. The Sins of Kalamazoo actually became a book about a murder that took place here. So there's some interesting stories resulting in that as well. So just some other things, if you're looking for future reading historically about where Kalamazoo shows up, those are some fun things for you. So this is basically the handout that you have. I just kind of threw this up there. In determining which people to put into the book, it was a challenge. As I mentioned, 150 people down to 50. I wanted to fit them into different categories. I wanted to make sure that I had people from the early founding fathers up to modern day people, people from different walks of life, people whose names you might recognize on that list, but I'm going to hopefully tell you some things about them either tonight or in the book that you maybe didn't know about them. So that's kind of a little fun twist on that. So We heard Glenn Miller's I've Got a Gal in Kalamazoo. And it was from the movie Orchestra Wives. It was part of the soundtrack for that 1942 movie. It hit the Billboard charts, and it was on the charts for 20 weeks. It hit #1 in September of 1942, and it stayed on the Billboard charts for 8 weeks. So for 8 weeks, everybody across the country was hearing this song about Kalamazoo. And it was also up for an Academy Award, but it lost out to Bing Crosby's White Christmas that year. Now, another interesting aside is White Christmas was actually written in Michigan, if you didn't know. Norman, his last name's now also escaping me, but the guy that wrote it, he had a summer home in Charlevoix. Anybody ever been up to Charlevoix to see the mushroom houses? His family had one of those mushroom houses, and he holed up in there, and that's where he wrote White Christmas. So to see this not win to something else that had a Michigan tie for me, with my interest in Michigan, was quite fascinating. So I am not going to lead us on a song of this because the last thing anybody wants to do is hear me sing. But here are the lyrics to I've Got a Gal in Kalamazoo, which we just heard playing there in that playlist as well. But you know, there really is a gal from Kalamazoo. Her name was Sarah Woolley. And she was a student at K College. And in 1942, they had a competition, and the students on campus nominated people, nominated girls that they thought represented who that gal would be, and she ended up winning that. She was 19 years old. She was a sociology major, and they described her as having she was a dazzling dark-eyed beauty. And after she ended up getting named and all of these articles showed up in the paper, she started getting fan mail, and she really didn't know what to do with this. Like, all of a sudden, she's a celebrity because she's that gal from Kalamazoo. And she lived until she passed away in 1981. So, did you know that celery in the late 1800s and early 1900s was a delicacy? We kind of think of it as like a cheap snack now, right? How many of you actually like celery? A few of you, okay. You either love it or hate it, right? It's just like crunchy water. But it was a big deal. And I found out that they served it in first class in the 9th course on the Titanic. So there was a boatload of celery on the Titanic. And it was served in a very special way because it was seen like as caviar in that era. It was a Victorian delicacy for the rich. People in 3rd class didn't get celery. Today they get celery. 1st class wouldn't. So they served it, if you could see in this ad how they have that vase. They serve the celery up in this glass or crystal vase with ice water to keep the stalks really cold and crunchy. And that was before they came out with the little trays that they would put celery in. And so they would have these beautiful vases sitting on the table where they would chill celery for all the hoity-toity people who wanted celery back then. Well, as I mentioned with that L. Frank Baum children's rhyme, celery was grown for the very first time commercially in the United States, they believe, right here in Kalamazoo. George Taylor here came to the Kalamazoo area in the mid-1850s. He was 53 years old. His brother, James, was already living here in town. And his brother James gave him a plot of land right up the road across from Mountain Home Cemetery. And that's where George established his first nursery. He was growing trees and specifically Norway spruce. He was growing early bedding plants, which Kalamazoo became well known for. Roses, flowers, fruit trees, and vegetables. And he was one of the first people to actually take celery. He brought seeds over from Europe, and he planted them here because the soil was that thick, mucky stuff that would grow celery really well. And he found it was well received, and so he then approached the owners of the Kalamazoo House and the Burdick Hotel, and he started talking to the chefs there, talking to them about how they could use this not only in those fancy vases for the people that were staying there, but also as an ingredient in soups, in stews, and other things that they could use as an ingredient for recipes. And so these became two of the first hotels in the country that utilized celery in their restaurants because of that introduction that George made to them. In fact, New Year's Day dinner at the Kalamazoo house, you can see right there that there is celery on that menu. So it was a really quite a big deal for Kalamazoo. And in some of the articles, it talked about how for 10 years he was the principal grower of celery, and he would sell it for 50 cents a dozen. So a bunch of celery for 50 cents a dozen. Before long, he outgrew his space up on the hill, and he acquired a parcel of land off of Portage Road. And he and his brother and his son kind of continued on this nursery operation, not only growing the celery, but other fruits, vegetables, bedding plants, and whatnot. And so it was really cool to pull up the old maps and see it identified out there. He had about 20 acres that they farmed. And this is kind of where, you know where, I think it's a Town and Country grocery store out on Portage Road. And there's a park just north there, but it started where that Town and Country was, and that parcel kind of came down south from where that particular place was. George was also a historian of his era, and he wrote quite a bit about his early history, how he got here. And there is a Mishweb page out there which has actually his journals that have been archived. So you can go out there and find all of that. And then one of the museums in Scotland published them into a series called From Kelso to Kalamazoo. So that's basically the website and all of his documentation of his time here. But he talks about his family, he talks about Kalamazoo, he talks about the celery operations. And of course, years later in the 50s, they dedicated a historical marker for Celery City. And then we, of course, have Celery Flats down in Portage, where you can learn a lot more about the celery history as well. George's story has been particularly fascinating to me for many years. I have a presentation that I give on Michigan agriculture, and it's always fun to talk about his involvement in that industry. But a particular note to me was that George Taylor was my 4-time great-granduncle. So you can thank my family for bringing celery to Michigan and to the United States. So I'm sure everybody knows Frank Henderson of Henderson Castle. Frank Henderson was born in New York in the 1940s, and he was about 19 years old when he made his way to Kalamazoo. And he founded a company called Henderson and Brown Company, specializing in hardware and saddlery, which of course would have been a big thing back in that time period in the 1800s. He later added uniforms and regalia to his lineup. This is his wife, Mary Taylor. They were actually married in the late 1860s. And a particular note on this is that Mary Taylor's uncle was George Taylor of celery fame. And the original Taylor farm was located not far from where Henderson Castle is. So it's amazing, you know how well connected Kalamazoo is, but the overlap in family stories became even more evident as I was doing the research on this book. So in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, 40% of the men in America were part of a fraternal organization. So they were a member of the Odd Fellows, they were a Mason, they were part of some civic organization. And of course those organizations are built on uniforms and pomp and circumstance and tradition. And so Frank banked on that, and he built a whole company based on this. And he was actually a member of several organizations himself. He was a 33rd degree Freemason. He was one time a Grand Commander of the Knights Templar. And so he lived that world, and he knew he could make a lot of money by creating these uniforms and selling swords and crowns and all of these things, not only here locally, but across the country. And it became one of the largest regalia companies in America, and he was known as the Regalia King. And it was all operating right here in downtown Kalamazoo. And of course, with this fame and all of this money that he had to build this amazing house to show everybody how rich and famous he was. And so Henderson Castle is a 25-room Queen Anne style castle that he constructed. It was built in the late 1890s, $72,000 at the time, which is just over $2.6 million today. Well, probably it still would be more than that. But he built it for his wife Mary, and then he promptly died shortly after it was built. So she got to live there for a few more years until she passed away, but they're both buried across at Mountain Home Cemetery as well. Now, everything in Kalamazoo's history is rosy and beautiful and fun. Did you know we had a witch here? Kalamazoo's witchy past. So this was a story that anybody part of the Vanished Kalamazoo Facebook group? So this was a great source of information for stories, and I think this one had popped up in there as well. So this is a newspaper article from the summer of 1929, and it is about a family who murdered a local woman by the name of Etta Fairchild. Etta and her husband lived in Kalamazoo. She was a widow, and so she stayed on and lived in the house with her husband, and then she lived in the women's home here in town. And her neighbors were a couple of people, their last name was Burgess. And the Burgesses were bizarre people. They followed a lot of cult followings, and somehow they got it in their head that Etta was killing all of the old people in the neighborhood. Well, you know what? Old people die, especially back in this time, in the early 1900s, right? But they were convinced that she was killing them. And so they felt they had to do something about it. So they invited her over to dinner at their house, and this was at 429 Ransom Street. I'm not sure if the house is still there. I should do a drive-by. But they invited her over for dinner, and what they served her up was a crack to the skull. And they killed her and rolled her up in the dining room carpet and put her in the cistern in the backyard. And then Pearl Burgess, the wife, who is the one on the lower right, she calls the neighbor to say, hey, we need help moving a body. What do you think the neighbor did? Called the cops, right? So the cops show up, the Burgesses are arrested, and interestingly enough, because of course in this era, in the 20s, there was a publication out there called True Detective Mysteries, and true crime was a big thing. So these are actually crime scene photos from that house. The police got there, and the Burgesses had done nothing to try to cover it up. Blood was everywhere, the rug was there, the woman's coat was still there, and then the lower picture there shows the cistern where they removed the body. And so this became this big sensationalized story. So Pearl and her husband were, Eugene, were arrested. There are their mug shots. That's Etta's death certificate there. So they're arrested, they're taken to the local courthouse, and they are going to be arraigned on Monday for charges of first-degree murder. Pearl actually did go to trial. Eugene took the easy way out. He hung himself in his jail cell. But they did send Pearl to trial, and what's really fascinating was that the library at Western has the logs, the court logs, those giant books that weigh like 500 pounds. And so when I was here a year and a half ago, I went over and they brought them all out on a cart, and I got to go through. And so these are actually photographs of the actual court transcripts from that trial. So the first one there is obviously before Eugene killed himself, but that's the list of the jury members. So I don't know if anybody sees any family member names on there. I thought that would always be fascinating. You go, oh wow, my so-and-so was a member of that trial. But they have all the transcripts that I got to go through, and basically Pearl got a second trial. She was convicted originally, she got a second trial, and it was deemed that she was insane, and they sent her to the asylum in Ionia, and she stayed there until she was in her 70s, and then toward the last few years of her life, she was released, and she lived with her daughter. So William Upjohn seems like a logical person to put in the book, right? Well, he was going to be in the book, but as I went through the family history, I found that the story of his dad was actually incredibly fascinating and one I didn't think most people knew about. So I decided to feature Uriah Upjohn. So Uriah and his brother actually came over from the UK and settled in New York first, and him and his brother actually went to medical school at the same time. And after they got their degrees, they ended up in Michigan, and Uriah bought a house, built a small cabin in what is today Richland, and his brother settled in the Hastings area, and they became country doctors. And so Uriah Upjohn would travel on horseback as much as 14 miles a day, going out, think about that Little House on the Prairie era, you're going out by horseback, visiting these homes, because people didn't go into the doctor's office, the doctor went to them. And he was also incredibly fascinated with nature and the healing powers of nature. So he would carry a saddlebag. This photo from the library, thank you very much. He would carry a saddlebag and he would gather herbs and flowers and other things along his way that he knew had healing properties, and he would make some of his own medicinal things for his patients during the course of his career. His brother actually went off to serve in the war, and he came in and served for his brother, carrying on not only his 14-mile route for his patients, but his brother's as well. So Uriah and his wife, they had 12 children, and 6 of them went into the medical field. 2 of their daughters became the first 2 women to attend the medical school at U of M, and 4 of his sons went into the medical practice, including William Upjohn, and his brother, who started Upjohn, which became Pharmacia, which became Pfizer. So most people know that story, but you think of coming over from a strange country and you're settling here, and you and your brother go to become doctors, and then you have all these kids in your family that follow suit, which I just thought was incredibly fascinating to know that many of them went into that field. All right, how many of you like beer? Right? All right, so this is Larry Bell. Larry Bell was from Chicago. And he ended up coming to go to school at K College and worked at Sarkozy Bakery. And while he was there, somebody else that he worked with started telling him about homebrew, like how you could make beer in your garage or in your basement. And Larry found that incredibly fascinating. And so he started to do some of that on his own, and then decided, I'm going to go into business. And he started Kalamazoo Brewing Company. It actually started as a homebrew supply store. And then he got into brewing beer, and his first commercially released beer was called, anybody want to know, can guess what Oberon was called before Oberon? Anybody know? You guys should know. Solson is the name, because you guys got it. So Solson, but I guess if somebody else had that name, and they had to change that. But, so Solson came out, then it was changed to Oberon, and Oberon is actually now their number 2 flagship beer. Two-Hearted Ale, the Bell's Two-Hearted Ale is actually their number one beer. But Larry was a visionary and a real leader in the industry. Of course, we had beer and spirits made in Michigan and in the Kalamazoo area in the late 1800s, and then of course it stopped during Prohibition. But in 1993, Larry worked with the legislature to change the law that allowed breweries to sell their own draft beer in their tap room. We take that for granted now. If we go to Bell's or any of the Michigan breweries and get a beer off the draft, you couldn't do that until Larry changed the law, helped change the law in 1993. You could buy beer to go, but you could not consume it there at the facility. So he really launched what became the craft beer movement here in Michigan. He added on to his eccentric cafe downtown in '96. Then he built his big facility out in Comstock. And then a few years ago, he sold. And now he travels the world. He just got back from Antarctica. I saw him earlier this month when I was here in town. But he's also giving back a lot. So I don't know what the dollar amount was that he sold bells for, but I imagine it was a pretty penny. And what he has done with that is he has made donations to the Irving S. Gilmore International Piano Festival, Kalamazoo College, the Boys and Girls Club, Michigan State University's Hospitality School, several other noted organizations. He's had a couple heart attacks, and so he's given money to help in the medical field in that regard as well. He's also on a quest to walk the entire Michigan section of the North Country Trail. Not at one time, but in different sections. I think he's got another year. Next year, he hopes to accomplish that. And the North Country Trail is over 4,000 miles of trails through, I think, 9 states, the most of it being in Michigan. And so he's trying to trek through that whole thing. He's also been Cubs fan. He has sailed with the Bay View to Mackinac yacht race as well. But I mentioned early brewing, and Michigan and Kalamazoo were actually leaders in this industry way back in the 1800s as well. And the library actually has 2 really great, I don't even know if they're articles, but if they are, they're long form articles. One on the history of brewing and one on the history of distilling. Because there was a lot, I mean, we like booze in Kalamazoo, I think, and historically have. This is Joe and Dorothy Birchnell, and they were very early brewers in town. They had come to America via Wisconsin and then settled in Kalamazoo, and they established Old Joe's Brewery, and what was interesting was she was the brewer. She was the brains behind it. His name was on it, but she was doing most of the work. So they would sell beer to local pubs and establishments, but they would also bottle it and sell it at local retail, you know, kind of like you'd go to D&W here now. After Joe passed away, she married again and continued to operate the brewery for a few more years. And we know it was her doing the work because she was the one filing the taxes. You know, you have these permits and licenses that you even had to have back then, and so she's signing off on the tax records. So this will show you also out by Millen Park where their farm was. They had about a 9-acre farm, and that's where the brewery operated. So it wasn't like going to Bell's now. They made the beer and then they transported it to pubs and to retail establishments for consumption later. Now disregard the typo in the last name. There's so many spellings for the Birchnell last name, but you'll notice the same middle name here. Joseph, who was one of Kalamazoo's most esteemed military men, he was a colonel. He was actually the grandson of Joe and Dorothy, and he was born in '72, and he enrolled, he was actually in the first winning football team at K College, and was dedicated into the Hall of Fame over there in more recent years. But he started with the Michigan Light Guard in 1894. He served in various areas in the military. He also was involved in the Jackson riots. He tried to go down there, and he was on duty to kind of settle up some of the things that were going on there. If you're familiar at all with the mining riots that were going on up in the UP in that era, he was sent up there as well. He served in World War I, and right after the end of the war, he got sick. He got a tonsillitis, and it ended up killing him. So we won the war, but he never lived long enough to come back to Kalamazoo after that. And it took a couple years before they were able to relocate his body. He was actually originally buried in France, but they brought his body back. Here they had a processional. There are photos of his funeral procession, and he was buried here again in Kalamazoo. And it was shortly after that time that they named Westminch Avenue after him as a testament. There was even talk right about the time, right before he died, when he was scheduled to come back, that they thought he might run for some political office in Lansing as well. So it was a pretty big loss to Kalamazoo when he passed away. I imagine there's not a single person in this room doesn't know that Kalamazoo was the home to Gibson Guitar, and this is Orville Gibson and his guitar factory. He was quite an entertainer. He would have minstrels, and he would travel around, walking around downtown Kalamazoo, and his band would be playing, and they would entertain people. But he had also started patenting some production of stringed instruments, and that was what led him to create and found the Gibson Guitar Factory. But he was a troubled soul, as many musical and artistic geniuses are. He spent time in and out of asylums, including here in Kalamazoo. And he actually died in an asylum in his 60s, I think in New York. But one of the things that is not in the book per se, but that I stumbled on was, we had, during World War II, they relied on the women, kind of like the women were making bombers and working on the planes at Willow Run. Well, they had guitars that they needed to be making. And so these women, they had about 70 of them, they were called Gibson Gals, were working in the factory and making these stringed instruments. And they were selling something like 25,000 stringed instruments during the war era. And so this is Irene Stearns, and she was one of those Gibson Gals. And actually today is her 103rd birthday. They had a celebration for her at Bell's yesterday, and they also, there's this whole dedication to her. But they did a big thing when she turned 100 a few years ago, and they declared her birthday Irene Stearns Day, like the city council or the commission declared that, and her daughters actually went to it. There's this whole documentary thing that you can, it's about a half hour long, that you can watch on YouTube, which talks about her life. The gentleman who wrote the book, Mike, who wrote the book about Gibson Gals, he has a short documentary that just is releasing in February at the Golden State Film Festival in California. And then he's working on a long form documentary based on the book. I haven't been able to determine when that time frame is for that to come out. So I was going to play that, but we don't have time for that right now. So that's the Kalamazoo Gals book and the documentary. I think it's about 12 or 14 minutes. And it's not online yet, but I'm hoping after they premiere it at in California that they will put that online. All right, Kalamazoo's first farmer was Enoch Harris. They called him Nuck Harris. He was born in 1784, so just a few years ago, in Virginia, to an unnamed enslaved woman. And what was interesting in this article that I found about him, which was actually published in 1902, was talking about his family backstory. And it says in this article that his father was a man who afterward held the highest office within the gift of the people of the United States. What position might that be? President? Right? So then I'm thinking, okay, who could his dad be? Who had slaves back then? So we went through, and George Washington never fathered any biological children. Thomas Jefferson was 31 at the time he was born, had slaves, and we know he had relationships with his slaves. James Madison was 23, so not out of the realm. And James Monroe was 16, so probably not likely, right? So if I was a betting person, and this is actually true, I'm leaning toward Thomas Jefferson. Just saying. And I know that there's been some articles out there about doing genetic testing to try to see if they can determine that. And I really hope they do, because I like a good mystery. I like to solve a good mystery. In any case, Enoch came to Michigan with his family. He was raised in Pennsylvania, made his way to Ohio, gets into Kalamazoo, gets married. Him and his wife here, Deborah, go on to have 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls. He serves as a private during the War of 1812. And he was also very active in the local community in addition to being a farmer. In 1840, he was listed as the only black family in Ashimo Township, which had been founded the previous year. But he owned tons of acreage. He had over 150 acres of land. He was regarded as one of the richest farmers in the area. Very well respected. And people in the area looked to him as a community leader. He lived until he was 85 years old, and his family is buried in a cemetery over off Parkview Street. If you head over across 131, and the cemetery there has a historical marker for the family. And then his family home was there until about 5 or 6 years ago. Actually, I take that back, about 9 years ago, when they actually bulldozed it down. But the field there, you can see where the house would have sat in that area. When he died, it was a pretty big sad day for the community because he had so much respect from other folks in the area. But he had celebrated almost 86 years. All right, everybody know the name Mary Alice Jackson? All right, you will by the time I'm done. I'm sure you know her. You just don't know that you know her. So she was actually born in Milford, Michigan, over on the east side. And she graduated high school in 1927 and made her way to Western Michigan, Western State Teachers College, which became Western. And she wanted to study acting. And so she was very involved in forensics, and she was on the acting team and was involved in plays. She really came to study under Laura Shaw, who was teaching at Western at the time. She looking familiar to you yet? Okay. So she, like I said, was involved in forensics. She was involved in the community players. And after she graduated, she went on to travel in some Shakespearean groups around the country. And then she made her big break on television. And she was in episodes of The Twilight Zone. She was in episodes of My Three Sons and of Hazel. She was in just a variety of different television shows. She looking familiar to you yet? Maybe you watched her on The Waltons. She was one of the Baldwin sisters. Miss Emily Baldwin. This one I picked because I love The Waltons. It's actually one of my favorite TV shows of all time. Remember they used to make the recipe? Like their moonshine, their daddy's moonshine? And the Waltons would always get in trouble when they went over there to take a nip of the moonshine. But she played that role even through the years of the Waltons and then all of those sequels that they did later on about the Easter and the wedding and whatnot. She was acting almost all the way up until her death. She was in, what was it? Hold on, there was an interesting movie that I noticed that she was in that maybe I didn't write it down. Like some horror movie of modern time. She was like playing a cameo in that. So pretty fascinating to know that she was there. You know, a lot of famous people went through Western. Obviously Tim Allen got arrested in Kalamazoo. He's not in the book. I opted not to put him in there. Who's the guy that plays? His name is Bruce. Plays in all of the zombie movies and whatever. Bruce Campbell was from Western. There's just a lot of people that kind of pass through there, different actors and actresses. All right, so this is Donald Bodeman. He's an antiquities collector who lived in Kalamazoo. He was born here in 1880, and he inherited some money when he was a teenager and allowed him to travel around the country and develop rich habits, and one of those was collecting rare and expensive things. And after the 1894 California Midwinter Exposition, which was kind of the World's Fair out there at the time, they had an exhibit out there called The Streets of Cairo. It was in San Diego. And Donald then acquired the mummy that was on display as part of this exhibit. And he held it in his private collection for a handful of years until he donated it to the museum and the library. It was originally in this building, wasn't it? I'm trying to remember. I was a kid when I came and saw it in this building. But he ended up donating it to the museum when it was in this building. Was the first of many items that he ended up donating to the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. They ended up doing, in the late 40s is when they first started doing some x-rays to try to determine, because originally they thought it must be a queen or a princess or somebody of note. Well, as they kept going through it, they were finding that maybe it wasn't necessarily the case. But this was the first time that he had done any x-raying of it, but they continue over the course of time. This is when they were moving the mummy out and to her new home over at the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. And that is where she is housed today. Okay, so Jacob Ferber's Popular Bazaar. Jacob Ferber and his wife came to Kalamazoo. They only lived here for 3 years, but he operated a bazaar store, not a bazaar store, a bazaar where they sold stuff downtown in an area what is now on Michigan Avenue. And while he was here, him and his wife, they ended up having 2 children, 2 daughters, and their daughter Edna was born while they were living on South Park Street. And Edna Ferber went on to become a well-known Pulitzer Prize winning author. She wrote some well-known things such as So Big or Showboat. If anybody's ever seen the musical Showboat, she wrote that original book. Giant, which ended up being James Dean's last movie, was based on her book. And she wrote her autobiography called A Peculiar Treasure. And in that she says, I may as well break down and confess that I was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan, shortly before the turn of the 1900s. Incidentally, there are no bronze tablets in my birthplace either. I've immensely enjoyed having hailed from such an improbable sounding place as Kalamazoo. So she does recognize where she came from. The book called Giant Love was written by her great niece. That was just released in November. It's an extended biography of Edna Ferber. How many of you have been to Louis? Well, okay, if you guys didn't raise your hand, I was going to have to question this whole situation. So, Louis, where everyone knows your name, that's our local hangout. My daughter's best friend used to work there, which is how I learned about it originally. Louis' restaurant is regarded as the oldest, longest operating bar/restaurant in Kalamazoo. And as I was getting up, ready to do the story, I was all going to do Granny. Because everybody knows Granny. Granny Nowak, we need to do that. And then I got in there and I thought, you know what? Ted had such a great story, so Ted won out. But anyway, Louis was founded opened up in 1918, so we just celebrated 100 years not long ago, by Polish immigrant Louis Nowak and his wife. And the family, some of them are here tonight, had provided these photos for me. They were also on the Vanished Kalamazoo Facebook page as well. And they quickly set out to create this kind of neighborhood bar and restaurant. What was fascinating, however, was the Prohibition years. I don't know if Mary shared these articles with you, But, you know, I'm sure they weren't the only ones. Lots of people were getting busted for serving alcohol during Prohibition in bars and restaurants in Kalamazoo, which was kind of fun when you go through the newspaper articles to see. But once we got through that blip of 13 years of Prohibition, things moved along. Well, this was another interesting story. Intense heat crazes woman. It was so hot that Mrs. Kate Belinsky inflicted on the head of Louis Nowak a pop bottle. The heat drove her crazy, apparently, right? It's so fun when you can find on newspapers.com. Okay, so second generation was Ted Nowak. And he, what I found so fascinating about his story was his love of sports. Not only of just watching, but supporting the local sports in the community. And, you know, the reason they call it Louis' Trophy Room now is because of all the trophies, you know, from all the teams that he would sponsor. Bowling teams, basketball teams, softball teams, baseball teams. If there was a pickleball around back then, he probably would have sponsored a pickleball team, right? So many different involvement. And really was considered one of the top athletic supporter communities and the business. I mean, it didn't hurt that all of the teams were wearing Louis on the front of their jerseys. I mean, that's free advertising right there, right? And so he really was, you know, a catalyst for the local community. So it wasn't just about, hey, come into my business and spend your money on my food and beverage. He was giving back to the community so much in the sponsorship of these various teams. This was his obituary. There was never a better, no more enthusiastic friend of sports in Kalamazoo than Ted Nowak. So it really was an interesting story to pick that up. Sarah Gwendolyn or Gwen Frostick. She's the little girl there in the center. In these other photos, she's the left on the photo on the right. Gwen was born in Wyandotte over in the Detroit area. And when she was just a few months old, she contracted what they think might have been polio or some kind of fever that led to conditions very similar to cerebral palsy. And so she walked with a limp. She had hands that didn't quite extend out, and she really struggled to get by physically for a while. But her mother was a teacher, and her mother pushed her and thought, you know what, if I put a pencil in your hand, you'll work your hands and be able to use them better. If I put scissors in your hands and you try to use those, it'll be therapy for your hands. And so her mother and father, who both worked in education, pushed her constantly. They never babied her to say, oh, you know, poor little Gwen with this limp and these malfunctioning hands. They said, no, you have to do chores just like your siblings. You have to work just as hard. Well, she found an interest in art, and in high school, she was born in the early 1900s, but so in high school, she's taking drafting classes and other industrial arts types classes that were mainly for the boys. Well, she went on to become an artist, and she was working, as she was in her 20s, she was working in that bomber factory at Willow Run, and at night she was perfecting her art, and she became an amazing illustrator and an artist, and she used a medium known as linoleum print blocks. So basically she would go out, she would sketch a picture, then she would go back and carve that picture in reverse on a piece of linoleum with an X-Acto knife. Can you imagine that, with like almost crippled hands? And then when she got done, she over time had acquired all these Heidelberg presses. And so she would turn it over kind of like a stamp. And she would print off all these amazing note cards and books. And she developed a huge studio up in Benzie County, Michigan, which still exists. It's for sale for $3 million if anybody wants to buy it. Comes with all the presses and everything. But she does an amazing international mail order operation there. Her artwork is amazing. I've been collecting her art for 20 plus years. She wrote poetry. I mean, once you see her, was anybody actually familiar with Gwen Frostigal? Okay. Once you see her art, you'll know it. It's very recognizable. Well, when she passed away, she never got married, never had any kids. But when she passed away in 2001, she donated her entire estate, all of her money, $10 million to Western. And it was at the time the largest donation that the college had received, and they ultimately ended up naming the art school in her name. And so not only do they have art programs for the students that are going through on the regular curriculum, but they do a lot of programs with local younger students. They do classes and workshops and things like that. But it's just really neat to know that she went to Western for a brief period of time. She didn't even get a degree here. She went to Eastern, and then she went to Western for a little bit. But she was so impressed with the campus here that when she passed away, because she didn't have any descendants, that she bequeathed her entire estate to Western. There's a great little biography about her out there, and also a children's book, which was my granddaughter's favorite book. All right, clowning around with Brownie the Clown. Anybody know Brownie? I think you know Brownie as somebody else. If you didn't know, we probably know him as Santa Claus. So Darwin Brown and his wife, Opal, were the most famous Santa and Mrs. Claus in Kalamazoo. They served for many years at Gilmore's department store. Here I am with my brother when I'm about 4 and about 6 based on the haircuts. My mom cut all my hair off. But he got his start as a clown, and he was doing Santa back early on before they even came to be doing the department stores. Opal made their costumes, and she would go home every night and curl the beard that he would wear, so we would always look fresh. He would go to work every day with 2 shirts so he could change midway through the shift, so he would stay crisp and fresh for all the children. And in the Vanished Kalamazoo page, there's a ton of stuff about them out there. And everybody, I love it at Christmas time because everybody puts their own family photos up there of when they've been, when they were there. Opal and Darwin also, he was also the voice of the Allegan County Fair. So if you've ever been to the fair and you know they run the voice over the PA system, it says, you know, harness racing tonight at 6, and don't forget to visit the animal barn and all of those kinds of things. He did that at the county fair in Allegan for many, many years. So he was the voice of the fair. For almost 15 years, I also did the voice work at the Allegan County Fair. So I knew about his history, and then digging in further when I found out, hey, we had the same job. I probably got paid the same that he did, which was basically tickets to the fair. So, our last story tonight was really the story that prompted the book itself. And I'm going to try to get through it without crying because it's about my dad. How it all began. This is my grandparents' house in Plainwell, where my dad was raised. And this was the radio that he would listen to at night as a kid and pick up stations from all over. And he listened to this as he's a 9, 10, 12-year-old. And that was what sparked his interest in radio. So right out of high school, in the early 1960s, he went over to this trailer, which sat in Otsego. It was the home of WDMC Radio, and he applied for a broadcasting job with them. And he must have done something right because they gave him the job, and he started working there almost immediately. So he's 17 years old at the time. From there, he ends up at WHTC Radio in Holland. He worked there for a few years in the early 1960s. This is where my brother was born. And after about 3 years at HTC, he ended up getting hired at and working his way to 1360 Melody Lane in Kalamazoo, which is home of WKMI. Thus the reason I'm wearing this WKMI shirt tonight. trying to find a copy of that record. If anybody has one, I'm willing to buy it off of you. But there is a song called Kalamazoo, and it's all about, from WKMI. So he ends up here in the early 70s. And back then, of course, AM radio was the thing. There wasn't anything beyond that. And he started in news, and then he made his way up, and he was the morning jock. He was the morning DJ there. And it was a great year. When I was growing up, kids coming to school, show and tell, what's your dad doing? My dad works at the bank, and my dad works at the paper company. I'm like, my dad is a DJ. How cool is that? Because my dad got to hang with people like Wolfman Jack.
Oh, wow.
And I wonder if that's probably the same shirt that my dad is wearing out there. He got to meet all of these cool bands. They used to do, is anybody from Kalamazoo remember KMI in the 70s? Okay, they used to do what was called a Miss Skimpy contest. That's the most PC photo I could put up there. But they would have these teeny bikini contests out there, and they would judge those. I remember the photo up at the top, I remember helping him get dressed for Halloween, when he was this mad doctor, and they would do stuff. I remember making the blood out of food coloring and splattering it on him. And growing up, it was really cool. I remember being disappointed when I walked in, and my early childhood, I thought all those bands came into the station and they were all playing live, like way back in the 50s and 60s. So I remember being disappointed to go in and like nobody's there, like I can't meet anybody. We used to play Yellow Submarine on the jukebox in the lobby at KMI. And KMI was interesting because they had a swimming pool in the backyard. So in the summer on Saturdays, we would go to the station after my dad got off the air and drink Mr. Pibb or Faygo or Town Club soda in a bottle next to the pool, eat Pringles. I thought it was the biggest deal ever, right? So my dad was here for 13 years, and in the early 1970s, he was there when Asylum Electra, which is one of the record labels, they would send off albums to the radio stations and suggestions on songs that they should play as they're trying to get songs released off of these albums. And so Asylum Electra sends an album to my dad. It's in 1974, and they're pushing a song from a band, a local band, and my dad said, you know what, I just couldn't get behind this song. It fell flat. I didn't really like it. So he picked a different song off the album, and he started playing that song, and lo and behold, it went crazy in Kalamazoo. Everybody wanted to hear it. They kept calling, back when you could call a radio station. And everybody on the request line wanted to hear this song. And Boogie Records was selling out of the albums and out of the 45s, and they couldn't keep it in stock. And then at the time, he was calling his counterparts, the DJs in Kalamazoo, or in Chicago and Detroit. They would all talk to each other about what was hot and what songs, and he's talking to them going, you know, they're trying to push this song, but it's not doing well, but what we're playing in Kalamazoo is hitting it. And so those markets started playing this song. And it was a song by a band, a relatively new band, that many people hadn't even heard of at the time, but their name were the Eagles. And my dad called and finally got the radio executives to release this song as a single. It was never even supposed to be released off the album. The band didn't even care about it. But they released it, and within 6 months, it became the Eagles' first #1 hit. Anybody know what it is?
Hotel.
It is not Hotel California.
Try.
Nice try. It was a ballad called Best of My Love. And I think February of this year will be the 50th anniversary of that hitting #1. And so those radio executives showed up at the station. This is the photo on the back of the book as well. Rip Pelly on the left and Bert Stein on the right. That's my dad in the middle. And they presented him with an autographed copy of the On the Border album cover from the band, the original band. It's changed a little now. Joe Walsh didn't sign it. He didn't come to the band until a little later. But Glenn Fry, Don Henley's signatures on there. And they presented that to my dad. And it hung in my dad's office. until he passed away in May. Now it hangs in my office.
No.
And Bert and Rip have become friends. We've kept in touch. In 2015, the Eagles were in Kalamazoo, or excuse me, in Grand Rapids at Van Andel Arena. And I called Bert Stein, who still works in the industry in Nashville, and I said, listen, Bert, listen. My dad's going to be 70 this year. He's never seen the Eagles, but they're 30 minutes away. What can you do? He goes, how many tickets do you want? Held back, I said 6. So he goes, we got it. So I called my dad, I said, hey, you want to go to a concert? My dad had been to a concert in 35 years. Want to go to a concert? Well, who? I don't know if I want to go. I'm like, it's the Eagles. Oh. Well, and we have backstage passes. Okay, I'm in. Right? So we roll in backstage at the concert. There's my kids and my stepmom and I are there. And I remember being backstage, and my dad was kind of a hermit. He hadn't really left Plainwell or didn't leave the house much. We took him to this show, and we delayed the concert by 15 minutes because Glenn Fry and Don Henley were asking him so many questions about how the song came to be and how it got to be played. And my son's a musician, my son in the blue shirt on the left. We're walking backstage to our seats, and I'm like, don't you even start picking up any of these guitars, because I could just see him picking up a guitar and going on stage. But anyway, we get situated in our seats. A friend of mine works at Van Andel, so we had the set list to know when Best of My Love was going to hit during the lineup that night. And if you've ever seen the show, like it's in ballads, they always like lower the lights, they lower them and they bring them back up. And Glenn Fry gets up there and he starts talking about the song and how it was never supposed to be released, and basically gives my dad a shout out from the stage. Of course, we're all bawling in the seats at this point. And he gave a shout out, and the Gazette did a bunch of stories about it at the time as well. And then about 2 years later, Rolling Stones did a whole special edition on the Eagles, and we weren't on the cover of the Rolling Stone, but we were inside of the Rolling Stone magazine. And I guess friends had gone to the concert after that. Don Henley would bring up the story quite a bit. Anytime they played in Michigan, they would tell that story again. So it made quite a circuit. So we take a lot of credit in our house for the Eagles. My dad went on from there. He ended up owning a station in Otsego called WQXC, which later became Cool 101. They did a lot of really great things. And then he operated an AM station in the basement of our family home until 5 years ago, and when he retired. And then he passed away in May of this year, or last year. But he was involved in a lot of other things. He used to run the Miss Plainwell pageant, including the year that I won on the far left there. He was not involved at the time of that. He stepped down that year. But he was also very active in city government. He served 6 years in city council in Plainwell. And last September, the city of Plainwell actually renamed the industrial park in Plainwell after my dad as well. So. But my dad is my greatest influence and my greatest cheerleader, or was. And so it was his story that really led to the writing of this book. He helped me through the whole thing, and our actual last conversation was about the book. So I dedicate that whole thing and to my whole career to him. He was also the admin of the City of Plainwell's You're From Plainwell If Facebook group, which is also instrumental in a lot of the stories. About 7 or 8 of the stories in the book are from Kalamazoo and with ties to Plainwell. So I have a special program on that I'll be giving next Tuesday in Plainwell. But I also want to give a shout out to the Vanish Kalamazoo page. Again, if you are on Facebook and are interested in Kalamazoo history, please join this group. It is really fascinating. It's like a trip back in time. When people pop up pictures about, do you remember this restaurant? Or if you're looking for something, you go, hey, you know what? Remember when the High Wheeler operated? You can Google and search it in here and talk about all the people that brought it up. It really is a great group and a great lot of research. So I want to thank them. And I also want to thank Ryan and the team here at the library for all the help and the access to the photos and things like that to help make a book a success. You know, writers can't do anything without the support of local libraries and museums for research. And one of my greatest things is just sitting in a library, and I was telling Ryan earlier, going through vertical files. I mean, it's like a flashback in time. Computers are great for research, but there's nothing like flipping through the vertical files and coming across old stuff and touching it with your hands. With that, I thank you for letting me share stories. I do have copies of my books up here. I will be giving a presentation in Tuesday in Plymouth, which will have us focus on that community. On February 11th, I'll be at the Parchment Library, which will have a different set of people. And then I'll be at the Gilmore Car Museum on the last Sunday of the month, which will have a whole other group of people. So keep following me around, I'll tell you more stories.